Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm editor-in-chief of Territory, Politics and Governance, and I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Professor Simon Dalby, who is at the Basili School of Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Simon is, to many people, a well-known political geographer who was educated at Trinity College Dublin, then went to Canada to pursue a graduate career and earned a PhD at Simon Fraser University. Thereafter joined Carleton University for some 2 decades before ending up at Wilfrid Laurier University. And Simon, over the last 30 years, I think it's no exaggeration to say, has been an absolute pioneer of the field of critical geopolitics. And over his academic career has migrated from an initial interest in the Second Cold War and US-Soviet competition towards environmental security, and most recently, his latest book was on the topic of Anthropocene geopolitics. So we have an extraordinary academic portfolio to consider, and it's a pleasure, as I say, to have Simon in conversation with us. And the final thing I'll say as part of the introduction, Simon's also been a fantastic friend to the journal. And if you follow the journal, which I hope you do, one of his pieces appeared earlier this year. Anyway, enough of the introduction. Simon, can I wish you good morning, of course, from Canada?
Good to be here, Klaus.
And thank you, as I say, thank you for joining us. And for those listening, just to say that as part of the conversation, I have a series of questions that I'll put to Simon. But please do use the chat function, because I will have a look at that. And if there are questions you'd like to ask Simon as well, I'll do my very best to introduce those into the conversation. So it's not just all my questions. Do feel free to suggest some of your own. Simon, can I start with something that I hope will interest participants? And that's something about you and your background, because one of the things that someone like myself who's worked with you on critical geopolitics noticed a long time ago, 2 of the pioneers of critical geopolitics, yourself and Gerard Toll, share lots of things in common, but I think the most obvious one is that you're both Irish. And I wondered whether coming from Ireland, growing up in Ireland, gives you a particular perspective or interest in political geographies of the state, in border matters, in identity politics. Would you say that was an important part of making you who you are as a scholar and a citizen?
It certainly was in my case. I spent the first few years of my life just across the border from where a couple of years later Gerard was actually born. I was in Enniskillen as a small child, and he was born in Monaghan and literally the other side of the border. The border was simply part of the conversation growing up. The B specials, the bombs, the threat of the IRA starting up some more violence was just part of the background. I remember as a child one of the July the 12th Orange Men parades, thinking even as a small kid that was kind of odd. When I went to school in a boarding school in Dublin, as it happened, I had somebody from Belfast, in my first day or 2 at the school, stick his nose about 6 inches from mine and yell at me, "Are you a Fenian or a Taig, or what are you?" I was completely and utterly baffled, because I didn't know idea what either of these categories were. But clearly they were identity categories that had, I quickly learned, an implicit geography coming from the south, as in contrast from the Belfast person posing the question from the north. And so, you know, it was simply part of the growing up. My grandfather, to his dying day, referred to the town of Cove and Cork Harbour as Queenstown, which was its pre-independence name. So place names, legacies of empire, and you know, most of my family had actually served in the British forces, despite the fact I grew up in Ireland. All of these things simply made you very conscious of place and politics. But I mean, I better confess that the point at which this all clarified in my teenage years was listening to rock and roll, of course, because how else did one get through one's teenage years in those days? Wishbone Ash, wonderful rock and roll band, had a song on the Argus album called Warrior. And I remember vividly listening to this. I have to be a warrior, a slave I couldn't be, a soldier and a conqueror fighting to be free. Wait a minute. How can you be a conqueror fighting to be free? I mean, this doesn't work. A wonderful rhyme for the song. But and then of course it dawned on me that actually fighting to be free usually is a matter of fighting on your own country, your own territory, your own place. Conquerors go elsewhere to inflict violence on somebody else. And I think that was actually the moment at which I really stopped and thought about geography and power, although it was a decade later before I actually got to writing about this stuff in my dissertation.
Yeah, because one of the things that has been very striking during the Brexit conversations that have clearly consumed my country for the last 3 or 4 years is that actually Irish commentators, I'm thinking particularly of Fintan O'Toole, the well-known Irish journalist, have been, I thought, extremely astute in diagnosing some of the tensions and the contradictions that the United Kingdom faces with regards to its relationship to its European neighbours. And so part of me always wondered is, and you think about Irish political geography as well, it just seems really very, very good at teasing out those sorts of conceits, I suppose, that John Agnew might have alerted us to a number of years ago around the territorial trap, around territorialized identities and borders, you know, being something that you desperately try and seal hermetically, at least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish are the first victims of English imperialism. I mean, in growing up in Ireland, that's what the whole history is about: is the relationship between the imperial power and one of its first colonies, and the tensions across the Irish Sea. The fact that Liverpool is one of the largest Irish cities, and the rivalries in terms of football fandom. You've got Irish fans for British soccer teams. I mean, this is all intrinsically interconnected in all sorts of complicated ways. As soon as you start to reflect on it, the geography becomes simply unavoidable in this. Whether that makes Irish political geographers particularly astute, I'm not sure. But clearly, growing up in one of the first states to actually break away from the British Empire, because in terms of the dismantling of the British Empire, most of it we think about it after the Second World War. Well, I mean, the first one to go in many ways was the Irish Free State. Civil War, following War of Independence. My grandfather was held at gunpoint by one of the factions in that Civil War. That history is just simply part and parcel of growing up there, and I think it's part of who I am because that's where I grew up. Does that make us better political geographers? I'm not sure, but it just makes us think about this stuff more or less intuitively.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you say will also resonate with anybody, particularly from outside the UK listening. I mean, I'm sure they'd be well aware of some of the very painful conversations we've been having around slavery, Black Lives Matters, the ongoing and enduring legacies of colonialism and empire. And I think part of what makes some of the work that you and others do so valuable is that actually you're constantly asking us to think critically of what exactly the nation state is and actually how we define that. And part of that definitional work is actually through space, through territory.
And I think that's one of the things that makes geographers ask questions that are somewhat different from the international relations discipline, which so frequently simply takes the state and the territorial state for granted. This is what John was going on about in the territorial trap. Geopolitics doesn't assume that sort of implicit container of politics that is part and parcel of the basic assumptions of international relations thinking, which is why they keep getting caught in all sorts of things that don't fit, because the nation state is a container of politics only up to a point. It's being dramatically reasserted. Back to my comment about rock and roll, of course, one of the other crucial lines in that verse is a slave I couldn't be. The history of colonialization, the history of slavery, and I presume it's a riff on that line in Rule Britannia, which is an assertion of dominance in precisely the refusal to accept the status of slavery. And that's profoundly important in terms of the British identity and the history of empire.
Yes, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, and I think that probably explains why, certainly in the United Kingdom, we've often been probably more enthusiastic in embracing and remembering the Second World War as a good war, as a good moment in history, and perhaps not thinking about the United Kingdom's relationship to empire, to Commonwealth, and particularly how that complicates, the story about, for example, the Second World War, where also Irish people fought on the British, if you like, on the British side as much as anybody else from the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere in the world. So yes, no, I think that to me would make very good sense. I think why you would be, possibly attuned to those things. The other thing that I think, particularly for people who may be more familiar with your later work than your earlier work, is something very interesting. If we were to take some of your major publications over the last 30 years, there's a very interesting, I think, trajectory in your work, which I can also see, distinct areas of interest, but also I can see threads that sort of hold these things together. And I thought I'd just remind you the three major works that I have in mind. The first was Creating the Second Cold War, published around 1990. The next one,
literally 30 years ago this month. As 30. Happens, Klaus.
Yeah, I was going to say, was it? Yeah. So that was the first one. That was the first book of yours I ever read. The second, of course, was Security and Environmental Change. And your most recent work is Anthropocene Geopolitics, which of course came out this year with University of Ottawa Press. So one of the things that I think is really interesting when you start to develop a sort of academic career running into several decades is people are often quite interested in that trajectory. How do you get from one point to another? And it's rarely a smooth, troublesome, free journey, because that's the nature of the work that we do. But if you were to kind of summarize for listeners, how did you get from Creating the Second Cold War to Anthropocene Geopolitics and everything in between? What kind of things would stand out for you?
Anthropocene Geopolitics, the recent volume, is actually dedicated to the memory of my friend Neil Smith. Because one of the connections was when I was writing Creating the Second Cold War, which was about the reconstruction of the Soviet threat in American geopolitical discourse. I simultaneously read Neil's Uneven Development book, where he was talking about the ideology of nature, and I was struggling to find within geography literature a way to actually think about some of the questions of ideology. But none of it seemed to fit for the analysis as I was doing about the Soviet threat. So I literally put that book aside, having made a mental note to come back to it, because clearly the discussions about the production of nature, the production of space simultaneously, but it didn't fit with the ideological analysis I was doing on the Soviet threat. I couldn't figure out how to make. I just put it aside and said I will be back to this because it's clearly very important. And of course, I did come back to it much later. And in fact, the book you left out, the Environmental Security, the 2002 one, is absolutely a series of reflections on some of the themes in Neil's work. But that said, the hardest bit of writing Creating the Second Cold War was actually writing the conclusion, because the concluding chapter is explicitly called Critical Geopolitics. And it was actually an attempt to draw out the threads from my dissertation and suggest what critical geopolitics needed to look like going forward. Part of it was all about de-alignment and rethinking the spaces of security with the European peace movement from the 80s. Part of it was also thinking, well, what does security look like if you get outside the West and outside the geopolitical confrontation between the superpowers? And there's a line in there talking about security for somebody in what we would now probably call the global south is more likely to be about a reliable supply of food and a roof than it is actually about the standoff between the nuclear superpowers, which for most people struggling to make a living across much of the rest of the world was completely irrelevant to their practical lived daily realities. Of course, it would have become immensely relevant very quickly if the nuclear superpowers had actually had a major nuclear war, because of the nuclear winter phenomena and the sheer destructive capabilities for both the economy and the ecology of a nuclear war would have fundamentally changed their lives, even though they may have been unaware of the fact that this danger loomed all through from the 50s, basically, from the late 50s through to the end of the Cold War. That danger hasn't entirely got away. But the final part of that chapter was to reflect back on the cultural identities invoked in geopolitical discourse, and to go back to explicitly quote Edward Said, because of course the role of a critical scholar is as a critic. It's not just doing positivist or quantitative or empirical research. It's that reflective process on the categories brought to bear on the material that we're actually studying. And so the book actually ends with Said thinking about culture, identity, place, and critique. And that, frankly, I think runs through everything I've written since in one way or another. More recently, of course, the environmental dimension has become much more explicit in what I've been dealing with. I was hired by Wilfrid Laurier explicitly to work on climate change, so it's perhaps not surprising.
Because for me, one of the real threads that binds, and I'm sorry I forgot that fourth book. I'm sorry, that's right. There were four I had in mind. Is your persistent interest, I think, in this idea of alignment, realignment, de-alignment. So there's partly this interest you have, it strikes me, in terms of political and ideological alignment and de-alignment, to make that point, but also environmental and ecological alignment or disalignment. Because I think one of the things that strikes me over and over again is the care that you take with language and discourse, but also about how language and discourse works or doesn't work to describe or to create or to bring something into existence. So, it seems to me that actually a lot of what you're talking about in the most recent book, but also actually in the first book, is often about these disjunctures, where one kind of talks about a system of nation states, but that sits very awkwardly with a sort of global ecology that clearly has little to no interest in those lines on the map.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's exactly it. I mean, the crucial point is the geographical designations that are implicit in political discourse. I like to tell my students, look for the attributes of place that are implicit in a policy discourse, which requires or necessitates particular modes of conduct because of the attributes of that place. So it's the implicit contextualization in much of political discourse that seems to me to be the thread that you start pulling to understand how politics discourse works. Because I mean, some of the most profound political categories are the taken for granted geographical designations, which we structure our life world and our thinking about it through, usually not reflected upon because they're just, just the geography.
So I think actually, because some of our listeners and participants won't be geographers, I mean, I think we should probably just give some examples to make this explicit. I mean, you and I would know the term meta-geography that Lewis and Vegan use in their 1994 book to talk a little bit about this. Do you want to give folks an example or two about what we mean by this?
I mean, frankly, right back to the beginning of creating the Second Cold War, what got me into this was Reagan. His speeches about the evil empire. And it was precisely the designation of the Soviet Union as an empire and as something that was evil. And of course, this resonated immensely with the whole Star Wars genre that was one of the American cultural themes at the time. And the empire was evil. If you could designate a place as having those attributes, well, then Star Wars came beautifully into focus. And I mean, Reagan was good at those kinds of cultural things. What everybody forgets is that while he was famous as a bad actor and the governor of California before he became president, and he spent, I think it was half a dozen years as a pitchman for General Electric. He learned how to communicate as an advertising guy, the great communicator. It was advertising, branding, and the cultural invocation of a whole cultural ensemble, as it were, by using just those right few terms. But empire is a quintessentially geographical category. It has capitals, it has frontiers, it is usually violent and glorious. Using that one word invokes a whole larger cultural understanding of the way the word works. We sometimes, instead of metageographies, talk about geographs, literally earth descriptions. And place is crucial in how danger is invoked, how virtue here and threat there is immensely powerful in political discourse. But to my point a moment ago, it's usually so obvious we don't analyze it. For critical geopolitics, that's the whole point, is you have to unpack all the cultural reference that go with that completely unproblematic distinction between East and West, free world and evil empire. But they're hugely powerful rhetorical formulations, which are all implicitly geographical. So the idea in critical geopolitics is to unpack the freight that goes with those and see what using that language actually allows you to do politically. And that's what I've spent much of my career doing. I find it fascinating, infuriating frequently, because geographical sleight of hand allows power to operate in all sorts of ways. And I mean, you know, to the Reagan point, that the moment at which this really crystallized was watching a video of him doing a speech to the researchers on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars. He gets to the end of his speech and he says, you know I'm not really supposed to do this, but let me just sign off by saying, may the force be with you. And of course, all the scientists in the room just, you know, erupted into this widely enthusiastic applause, because he'd said exactly the right thing for them all, because they were all Star Wars fans, right? Yeah. And he had the good sense to play that kind of cultural game with them, which is why he was called a great communicator.
Yeah, sorry, and just to say as well, I mean, I think, you know, if one was looking for other examples, you know, the United States often described the Caribbean as part of its backyard, yeah. Or Russia would describe much of the Euro-Asian landmass as potentially part of a near abroad, and so yeah. You know, there's kind of political geographers. I think if anyone's in any doubt, there shouldn't be, that actually these kinds of categories and descriptors of place we would never take for granted. We would always interrogate. And those sorts of categories and those sorts of assumptions that there is a sort of stable earth that we can describe and draw lines around and categorize seems to be being scrambled at the moment. That actually the taken for grantedness of the earth is no longer quite as assured. And I think you're right. I think when you say that this world composed of, I'm going to quote you, competing territorial states is not only outdated, but out of time in a very, very profound sort of way. And yet you also note that if you like, the allure of the territorial state is far from over. So are you worried, in other words, that actually this again, to return to this idea of disalignment, really has profound consequences for humanity and our relationship with Earth? If in other words, if we can't sort this out, then the future is grim.
I think that's exactly right, Klaus, and that's the whole purpose behind the Anthropocene Geopolitics book. That book comes out of a project called Borders and Globalization, where they actually asked me to work on sustainability themes in that project. And as I began to sort of tease out how do you think through borders, globalization, and sustainability in conjunction, it sort of sent me back to some of the stuff in particularly the 2002 book. And that was, one of the key themes in that was, of course, precisely about the ecological consequences of colonization. And the forgotten histories of displaced peoples, particularly the indigenous peoples of North America, was absolutely crucial to thinking that through. But as I began to think about the more recent discussions, it became clear that yes, globalization was mixing up the geographies quite dramatically. All this discussion about commodity chains, all the discussion about global finance, about fictitious sovereignty for hiding money. The whole reinvention of Caribbean islands as major banking centers. I mean, utterly bizarre disconnect from the conventional understandings of territorial states. But at the same time, the whole climate change thing is suggesting a dramatic series of changes ecologically, partly as a consequence of the ever-extending processes of colonization. The Amazon frontier with Bolsonaro and burning rainforests is very much on most ecologists' minds these days. Those ongoing processes, but climate change is also clearly driving things like rising sea level. It's going to eliminate many of the small island states in the foreseeable future. It's going to eliminate most of Florida too. And in fact, in practical terms, the stable baselines of coastline, they're gone. The stable assumptions about what you can grow where in terms of the predictable weather patterns for particular kinds of crops is going in many places. And the ice in the Arctic is disappearing, opening up all sorts of new potential trade routes and anxieties about who's doing what up there. The stable geography, the maps with the nice, neat boundary lines are the administrative structure we have, which is increasingly both being directly changed in terms of ecological systems moving, coastlines moving. All of that is now a non-stable geography. The hydrologists talk about non-stationarity. Which means that you can't actually predict future rainfall and future climatological features on the basis of the last, they usually talk about the hydrological records over the last few decades, if hopefully back to 100 years. That's not a reliable predictor of future conditions because of the sheer scale of the transformations that the Anthropocene and particularly our use of what I call firepower in terms of combustion. To change. So the stable geography that is assumed is gone. And we are now having to think about security and spaces in terms of a much more dynamic world, both ecologically and economically. And those two things are, of course, intimately interconnected. Yes. I'm trying to find a vocabulary to imagine the future in ways that is useful in the classroom, useful in popular culture. And hence the term, the technosphere, quite literally, this new, increasingly large entity that we are creating in the Earth system seems to be really important. But I'm also trying to link this with the violence of colonization, the violence of transformation in this use of the term firepower, because of course the one thing that makes us uniquely human is that we mastered the ignition trick a very long time ago. We partly control one of the key geophysical processes in the Earth system, and we're the only species that have ever done that. Yes. That makes for a new geological epoch driven by the extraordinary behavior of our species. That's the biggest context in which we now need to think, and it's a big stretch from the conventional understandings and the discussions of global environmental politics and so on. But those are the times we live in. That's how the recontextualization of the human predicament now has to be understood. And I'm trying to nudge people to think about those really big questions in that latest book.
I think it's also, it's also a challenge for those of us who, work in this sort of field of geopolitics, where, in terms of part of our socialization, it often involves reading writers and theorists who trade in really quite hardwired distinctions between land and sea powers, or assume there are these kind of really elemental distinctions that we can make between land, sea, air, ice. And I think what we appear to be learning ever more about climate change is that these categories anyway are suspect, and that they are being either they're mutating, or they're dissolving, or they're being reformulated in ways that actually it makes it quite hard to distinguish. For example, in my own case, working in the Arctic, what is a distinctly Arctic environment is becoming more and more challenging, as it's clear that the Arctic is becoming literally Pacified and Atlantified, because of warmth, because of acidification, because of melting, because of thawing. And so that earthly writing, that sort of geopolitics that we aspire to in terms of critical scholarship, is becoming correspondingly harder, as you say. And I think part of it is finding that sort of conceptual vocabulary to make sense of all of this.
Daniel Dewdney's latest book, Dark Skies, extends this even further, arguing that we have to understand the planet as including sort of near Earth space, outer space, actually running out many thousands of miles has to be considered as part of the planet, because of satellites, because of the dangers of nuclear war using ballistic missiles and all the rest of it. Again, his argument is we need to further shove those flexible, changing geographies into that larger context, because only then are we actually going to really understand the planetary predicament that our technologies have actually created. And technology, of course, is crucial to geopolitics, and the dramatic changes that come from shifting from wind-driven naval vessels to coal-powered to oil, and most recently to nuclear, of course, changes how technology, force, and space work. And we are simply unavoidably enmeshed in this stuff. And of course, the latest one clearly is digital. And what's happening in cyberspace is beginning to change politics in all sorts of interesting ways. But it's not at all clear how that is playing out.
See, I was going to ask you as an aside, Simon, in terms of, as you mentioned, firepower, and I'm thinking of energy, is whether you think, for example, if we are successful in engaging in a sort of energy transition, a move away from hydrocarbons, is that actually grounds for optimism that actually a new energy order might bring about a different kind of geopolitics, one that is less tied to the stuff that we're very familiar with, which was the kind of Cold War, often Cold War antagonisms, tension, strategic calculation over places like the Middle East because of those oil and gas resources? Or will we actually see something quite different, where actually oil and gas producers attempt to hold on to their structural geopolitical advantages in ways that don't necessarily help us with a more peaceful, let alone equitable transition?
Well, that's exactly the political argument that is playing out in North America at the moment. And the attempt by the oil industry and the fossil fuel producers to maintain their stranglehold on energy supplies in one way or another is part of what's happening. The rise of cheap, and it is now cheap, renewable energy in comparison. I mean, in many jurisdictions in North America now, renewable energy undercuts even natural gas, and it's causing all sorts of market upsets. The structures of utilities are absolutely crucial, because of course utilities don't often want to morph themselves into distribution systems when they've traditionally been centralized production systems. When it comes to the Middle East, well, this gets particularly complicated. Lots of talk out of Saudi Arabia over the last few years about going solar, but in present circumstances, is that actually going to transpire? The Desert Tech project of 15 years ago was going to put big solar farms in the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa, and put high voltage cables to Europe, including, I noticed some of the maps actually had cables running right through the middle of Syria. There's a geographic imagination of these massive projects which might provide an alternative source of revenue for Middle Eastern states as they try to wean themselves off oil revenues. In present circumstances, that kind of massive technological innovation seems much less likely. Nonetheless, it does suggest a very dramatic regional geopolitics that might be very, very different. Can we get there peacefully? Well, that's the big question in terms of regional politics at this stage. But clearly, a lot of the oil reserves, the gas and coal, simply has to stay in the ground if we've got any chance of slowing down climate change. Because to your point about the Arctic a minute ago, what everybody tends to think about, well, we've got an average global temperature of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius increase. Well, I mean, that was long gone in the Arctic. I mean, I've been remembering 19 years ago, I was in Inari in the north end of Finland. And then that was back in 2001. The reindeer herders were really hoping that some of the geographers, including some folks from Moscow State, if I remember correctly, could actually provide them with some GIS technology which would allow them to track the reindeer who were now, in 2001, already trying out new innovative migration patterns to deal with the changing Arctic environments. That was 20 years ago, 19 years ago. And we, again, have to think of the geography of climate change playing out very differently in different places. And that's the other side of the sort of the ecological geopolitics, or as I like to say, the political geoecology of the transformation that we're living through.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question from one of the participants, actually, Simon, which is, in terms of helping us think about other sorts of geopolitical trends, because one of the things that the pandemic has brought out, I suppose, which we're clearly still living with, well, there's two possibilities. One is that we see the sort of the nativism, the populism, we must shut our borders kind of geopolitics, which says, actually, we're quite comfortable with the nation state being a container and a territorial trap. Thank you very much. And there are good reasons why that might be so in terms of public health. Jacinda Ardern's been quite clear that New Zealand sealed its borders and it led to a particular outcome. Of course, there's another element to all of this, which is that the pandemic might have encouraged a more collaborative geopolitics, that even some countries like China and Russia have seen opportunities to do public health, medical diplomacy, and that for all the bluster of Donald Trump with regards to the World Health Organization, there is also, I think, through crisis, as President Obama used to say, opportunities to sort of sketch out a different kind of geopolitical vision. If we were thinking about the pandemic, and given everything we said about the Anthropocene and energy, are there other things that you take away from what we're living with at the moment that might lead to a different kind of geopolitical imagination?
It cuts both ways, as you said. Yes, the nativist close the borders, keep the virus out stuff, rhetoric which Trump was using again in the last few days down in Arizona. But it's patent nonsense because the people building that chunk of fence are actually COVID positive. The virus has gone the other way from the United States into Mexico on occasions. Patently, obviously, walls don't work to deal with this kind of stuff. The upside, I am hoping, of all of this is the clear recognition that immigration and walls are not the solution. And the potential for an upside on this is the recognition of the interconnectedness. Perhaps there are some benefits to thinking about local provision of medical. We all know the acronym PPE, the personal protective equipment. And of course, that was globally sourced with supply chains all around the world, which then got disrupted as soon as borders started to get closed. And it really stops and makes one realize that actually the just-in-time philosophy of limiting costs, sourcing all over the globe needs to be complemented by just in case.
Yes.
Because clearly we need preparations. And if, back to the 2009 book about human security, what I was trying to say there is that all the talk about rural vulnerabilities and all the rest of it is missing the potential disasters for big urban centers coming from more extreme weather events and so on. And it was the lack of preparation, both in the case of Hurricane Katrina and that huge flood in Mumbai the month before Katrina, that was very, very clear. We are dependent on the infrastructure, dependent on those supply chains. Can we actually disconnect some of those and have multiple factories all around the world producing key commodities, so that if one gets underwater, the rest of the world's economy can continue? It may be slightly less efficient in some economic senses, but it's much more sensible in terms of being able to multiply source crucial things that the urban populations need. I'm hoping that we get that response in conjunction with the necessity of reviving the World Health Organization, because clearly we are vulnerable to diseases as a global species. We need to think about it as a global species if we're dealing with pandemics.
So just, I'm going to try and link two questions that have come in from our participants. One is about climate change and whether it's possible to think of either open borders, as someone like Rhys Jones has been a very powerful advocate of, or as one of the participants says, a kind of a non-border, whether actually these sorts of things can be taken away from that sort of dominant administrative, political, legal administration. With another sort of question asked by another participant, which is around how this connects to ongoing decolonization. So, it's that sort of, again, that very, very awkward, I suppose, disjuncture between, on the one hand, saying, yeah, we've got to think about a world where these borders somehow matter less. But on the other hand, we're also dealing with a world where actually for a lot of nation states, just simply having some kind of recognition that they have some sort of national territory is still, to put it charitably, a work in progress.
And therein lies precisely the tension that we're all struggling with. There are all sorts of states that require recognition, but also are invoking sovereignty as a way of trying to get it. And the decolonization process requires it seems, the construction of nationalisms in many places. Trying to gain some kind of local control is what much of decolonization has always been about. And yet, back to the point about Brazil and all the rest of it, in many ways, even post-colonial states are perpetuating colonial practices in terms of appropriating indigenous people's lands, literally bulldozing people out of the way to build mines and dams, of course, in the interests of providing revenue and power and materials for the metropoles. So we have this bizarre series of geographical assumptions about the way the world ought to work with autonomous nation states, but it just doesn't fit with both urbanization, because that's rapidly moving ahead, as well as the global economy. So there's no simple way of teasing this out. It's mostly an empirical question for geographers to actually go and look at how is this working out in particular locations. And of course, lots of graduate students these days are doing precisely these kinds of questions in particular places. I don't have a simple overview to this. I'm much aware of the fact that it's also now completely overlaid by this kind of conversation, by the internet. And I mean, who saw, K-pop and TikTok as the answer to Cambridge Analytica in American electoral politics until the last couple of weeks? It was suddenly, yes, of course, teenagers and perhaps not such teenagers watching K-pop online and then, doing all sorts of false registrations for Trump's rally, completely trashing the kind of data set which was what Cambridge Analytica used in the last election to facilitate Trump voters actually casting their ballots. So we've got a whole additional electronic dimension to this, and it is K-pop. I mean, Korean boy bands. What? Again, the global cultural phenomena is once again getting us to reflect on the implicit geographical designations of cultural identities, which are being scrambled increasingly now because we are all forced to sit home, but have these conversations using Zoom and all the other novel technologies we're all learning to use badly.
Yeah, because again, I think another question that's just sort of been posed here as well, and it's one of those big questions that's difficult to condense. But again, it revolves around this idea of how we reconcile a international system of nation states that, as we know, is struggling to deal with the ongoing realities of climate change and the Anthropogenic era, with a world that is becoming increasingly urbanized, a world that is predicted to be growing to 10 billion people, a world where the dash for renewables is in danger of being seen as a technological fix, as opposed to actually provoking something very, very profound, which may mean, for example, we have to think about our economies as post-growth, let alone, or actually shrinking in some sense to accommodate the demands that we will be placing on this planet in the decades and centuries to come.
And I think that's one of the things that the whole pandemic stimulus response question, Green New Deals, I mean, I like to say, what are we actually literally making? Mm-hmm. Part of the argument in Anthropocene geopolitics is that we have to understand environment as a production problem, not a protection problem. We have to literally understand, are we making solar panels or carbon dioxide? Are we making flourishing regenerative agricultural spaces or monocultural extractivist spaces? We literally have to think about which investments are going into which kind of production system. Because literally we are now making the future of the planet on a scale that is up there with the other geophysical processes that have shaped the Earth system. We need to stop and think about this. Yes, beware the technological fix, and I think your point about renewable energy and as a technical fix is crucial, because we need energy systems that don't rely on combustion if we're going to slow down climate change so we can cope with what's already baked into the system. But it's not going to provide the technical fix which allows us to continue with the consumption patterns that we've had in the past. Basically, the pandemic closed down the largest industry on the planet, if you understand tourism to be an industry. And it's gradually, the airlines are gradually reopening some at least of their flights now. We have got to think about which bits of the economy need to be invested in and which bits can we live without. I mean, again, this is the huge irony of ecotourism as an environmental strategy. Because yes, it provides consumption spaces which allow the protection of particular species in particular places, but at the cost of vast amounts of jet fuel to get the tourists there to admire, well, whatever trees or animals or combination that is deemed culturally desirable as a consumption phenomenon. We have got to figure out which bits of the economy we need to grow, because clearly we need to grow renewable energy. We need to very rapidly grow retrofitting buildings. We need to very rapidly grow innovative building rules, codes, regulations that simply don't allow the construction industry to build buildings that have furnaces or anything that requires combustion. In France, I mean, that part of the economy has to grow. Can GNP or GDP actually be the metric that we need to deal with that? I'm highly dubious about what metrics we actually need to measure that stuff. We have got to rethink an economy. We've got to rethink our vulnerabilities. Clearly, the pandemic has made this abundantly clear to most people that are stopping to think. And that then provides an opportunity to actually rethink what kind of economy we construct in future decades, because we literally are making the future of the planet in those decisions. And that's the complete change of scale and perspective that I think we've got to try and grapple with. Which metrics where is not easy.
No, and do you think in the meantime, however, there's going to be no shortage of evidence which suggests that actually some of the old ways of doing things will unquestionably persist? So one of the things I'm kind of thinking about as I'm listening to you speak is, what's the future of military power, military force? Do you think, for example, anything of the above in terms of what you've recently just reflected upon will make it any more or less likely? And I'm thinking in the 1990s, where there's lots of predictions about water wars. I mean, this is what we were going to be looking forward to, in inverted commas, as oil became less important. So there's a sort of another element, as you know, within geopolitics and international relations and elsewhere, which says actually, all these things are necessary. We need to be thinking about this, but actually, what's more likely, I'm afraid, is that the old ways of doing things, territorial competition, resource scrambles, conflict over water and other critical minerals or whatever it might be, that's what's going to prevail.
Well, if you're reading Paolo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife about the future of the American Southwest and his extraordinary novel on these things, yes, you come to that pessimistic conclusion. But that's the political struggle of our time. Is it possible to think politically and cooperatively? Down that route goes more trouble. It may be good for certain military factions. But I think there's a much larger question that simultaneously with the pandemic has been raised, particularly in this whole Black Lives Matter protest movement. The militarization, particularly of Anglo countries in the aftermath of 9/11, has simply come now literally in people's faces with the pepper spraying and the violence of sort of occupation forces kind of policing. And clearly, the revolt amongst the young people in particular about this, I think, is also raising the larger question of violence and the larger question of what kind of societies do we wish to actually have. I mean, one of the arguments about climate change and violence, of course, has long been that if you can actually get off fossil fuels, well, then there's no impetus for great powers to actually intervene in the Middle East. Most of the wars there aren't explicitly about oil, but oil is a crucial factor in them, an important distinction. The other side of this, of course, has everybody worried about the coup in Bolivia and whether this is actually driven by hopes on the part of some mining companies to get cheap access to the lithium salts and so on in the Andes. Those kinds of resource scramble issues, unfortunately, are with us. And of course, as a Canadian, one is very conscious of that because so many of the big mining companies are listed just down the road on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So Canada's always involved in one way or another in these things, although Canadians like to forget this frequently. Now, to your, to the final point about this, I'm still utterly baffled about why the British Royal Navy is building 2 large aircraft carriers. What for? What plausible function can they possibly serve in the present circumstances? They certainly ain't any good for dealing with climate change, that's for sure. In that sense, the tradition of military habits is enormously persistent, and that too is trouble. But on the other hand, there's huge ironies. One of my graduate students earlier in the year is a reservist in the Canadian Forces. And we got to chatting about precisely some of these issues. And he was saying, the Chief of Defence Staff in Canada is really worried these days. And what's he worried about? He says, well, because of climate change, the Canadian military is being used for disaster responses. But most of the floods and most of the storms have been responding to have come early summer, which is precisely the time that training for reservists, training exercises are usually scheduled. He hasn't been able to do a serious training exercise in the last couple of years because climate change is triggering the use of emergency personnel, and well, the military is the institution of last resort. And of course, the medics from the Canadian military are in a number of the long-term care facilities trying to clean out the pandemic disaster from the mismanagement of our long-term care facilities in Canada. So once again, crucial military personnel are being reassigned for civilian tasks once again in the training season for the Canadian military. So we have these extraordinary interconnections that I'm trying to tease out, but I don't have a clear pattern of how these things work.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say something, because I think that's really interesting, that observation you just made about your grad student and the Canadian reservist, because, you know, clearly in many countries, I mean, Pakistan comes to mind, the armed forces are absolutely essential in things like disaster relief, and actually maybe one of the few organs of state that are comparatively respected and trusted as well. And so, and this is, I think, of course, not unique to Pakistan, it's actually all over the world, but it also contributes, wittingly or unwittingly, to militarization. Yes. That actually, as the state retreats, as austerity bites, even in the privileged global north, one turns increasingly to the military, you know, and the paramilitary to do that sort of essential work.
And this is why, you know, with the problem with the militarization of policing, the demand to defund the police in many parts of the world is precisely to get the money into the agencies that are needed, the public health agencies, which have been seriously underfunded as the money has gone into an increasingly militarized police force. But beyond that, then we need to think about the role of Coast Guards, civil defense institutions, preparation like public health facilities, because therein is where security for populations in this radically urbanizing, changing world actually lies. And this is back to one of my themes the whole way through my thinking, can we reimagine security as the provision of health for urban populations rather than the budgets for aircraft carriers? And in terms of how states respond to the pandemic, you know, one of the things that has been a real problem is where the military has been called in to do policing duties, they have a whole lot of medics, which are very useful in the case of Canadian long-term care facilities. But which part of that military gets used? Can we actually build a civil defense public health infrastructure? Because that's clearly what urban populations in the 21st century need. Frankly, I don't see why we need F-35s and aircraft carriers. But in terms of how we understand security, it is related to what dangers are portrayed as that against which states should prepare, which takes us right back to the questions at the heart of geopolitics for the future.
Yeah, I'm sort of conscious we're coming to the end of our allotted time for the conversation. Just very quickly and finally, Simon, if you were just to give us a hint of what the next book project is going to be. I think you've started to sketch some of these things out. In a nutshell, what is that working title for us before we unfortunately have to draw things to a close?
Well, I very recently did sign another book contract. Having vowed I would never sign another book contract until I'd actually got a manuscript in hand, I went ahead and signed a contract without anything written. It's part of the Edward Elgar Rethinking International Relations series. It is, believe it or not, 48 years since the Limits to Growth was published in 1972 and the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment happened. And I've been in touch with a whole lots of folks in Sweden and Cyprus in particular, thinking about all of these themes in terms of geopolitics and security. And I'm trying to pull together sort of a reconsideration of the history of the last 50 years. Dan Smith is all over Cypri's websites recently saying that, in fact, we are now living in the world that the 1972 conference hoped to avoid.
Yes.
And I think that puts the matter better than anybody else has. And hence my project is to go back and rethink how security and environment been reconsidered through that 50 years. Because quite clearly, what the attempt in Stockholm in 1972 to avoid, we haven't succeeded in avoiding it. We haven't got We haven't really got environmental security thought through in a way that connects with the political priorities for our state structures. Yeah. And that's what I'm going to spend the next while working on.
Well, can I wish you well with that? It just sounds incredibly timely, and I think will be a sort of fascinating experiment in counterfactual geopolitics, you know, how things might have been different and different kinds of decisions and opportunities had arisen. But Simon, thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for answering my questions, but also the questions put to you via the question and a function of the webinar. Thank you also finally to the participants for your questions. I apologize if I didn't get to all of them, but it's a testimony, Simon, to you and the conversation that there were many more questions that I was able to attend to. So thank you again, and
have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye. Bye.